Okay, different muscles have different innervation ratios of these motor units, meaning that the innervation ratio is the number of fibers innervated by a singular motor neuron. So a low ratio would be, let's say in this case, like the muscles of the eye, you have one neuron innervating 23 muscle fibers, okay? That's a low ratio, okay? Compared to, because it's only one neuron with a low number of fibers. That's different than a muscle like the vastus lateralis, where you have one neuron innervating 1,000 fibers, okay? So what we know about the action potentials and the motor unit firings or the muscle contraction, when that motor unit, when that axon sends the action potential down to the motor end plate, all the muscle fibers in that motor unit, they're going to contract, right? Right? It's not like, you send the action potential and out of 1,000 fibers, 500 are firing and the other 500 are not. That doesn't happen, right? They all contract. So what we end up seeing is that muscles that have a low ratio, they're actually better at fine motor control, because you can more delicately select which motor units and how many muscle fibers to activate more discreetly, versus like, I gotta contract my VL. Well, it's much harder to, increase like just a 0.5% of a Newton on a VL, contraction, because the VL is contracting. It's going to turn on 2,000 fibers just from even a small thought of activation. Whereas the eye muscles, you only have to turn on just a few motor units to turn on just a few muscle fibers to more delicately control the force production and dexterity. Okay, so muscles like in the hands, right? Muscles in the eyes, things that require fine motor control, they tend to have lower ratios so that you can more delicately apply force. Okay, I can specifically just like slightly move this mouse if I wanted to. If the hands of my muscles, if the motor units of my muscles had a higher ratio, I might try to move this mouse and fly through the wall, right? And if I try to like move that mouse with just my quad, I'm gonna be not that great at just moving it a minuscule amount, because the quad's contracting, and then just even the lowest effort is activating maybe 500 fibers versus maybe 2 fibers there, right? So we have this trade-off between force production, muscles built for maximum force production, versus muscles that are built for fine motor control. You can't have a muscle that has a lot of motor control and produces a lot of force, because they're innervating different ratios of muscles based on the motor unit, of muscle fibers based on the motor units. Does that make sense? Okay. This relates to motor unit sizes, okay, as well. So if we look at this image here, okay, this is essentially a summary of the motor units. If we look at this image, how many motor units are on this graph here? Two, right? Why do we say there's 2 motor units here? What tells us there's 2 motor units? Neurons. There's 2 neurons. There's two axons, okay? How many muscle fibers are on this? You can count them. There's 8, correct. So the neuron on top is innervating 3 fibers. The neuron on the bottom is innervating 5 fibers. Which of these motor units is larger? The bottom, because it's innervating more fibers, right? So the motor unit on top would be smaller because it's innervating less fibers. The motor unit on the bottom would be larger because it's innervating more fibers. If all these fibers are the same size, which motor unit is going to produce more force? The one on the bottom. Why?
It has more fibers.
It's innervating more fibers, right? So both those motor units could contract at the exact same time. But even if the muscle fibers were the same size in all the motor units, the one on the bottom will produce more force because they have more muscle fibers contracting at the same time compared to the other one, okay? So here we can see that this, keeping your notes, larger motor units are going to produce more force because they innervate more fibers. Smaller motor units produce less force because they innervate less fibers. Now, if you look at this, what would these fibers have to do to produce more force than these ones?
Stronger electrical signal.
Stronger signal? Well, what do you mean? If the action potential is being sent, it could, maybe send more action potentials that could produce more force, right? But if we're just talking about the fibers in this unit versus this unit, what would this one need to do to produce more force than here?
Push back more. So it's faster.
Faster.
Could you add more fibers?
It's already, well, potentially, right? Theoretically you could, but in humans, you're not really seeing with training that you're significantly innervating more motor neurons and more fibers. There's some branching, we'll cover it next class. There is some branching going on, but it's not like you're significantly changing your innervation patterns, right? But if we're just talking about the fibers themselves, what could they do? Increase size, right? So if this motor unit was active, if it's only turning on 3 fibers here, the only other way that it could match the force of this motor unit or even produce more force is these fibers would have to get bigger, right? So this motor unit could get stronger just by having these fibers get bigger, okay? So in some sense, yes, this is a motor unit that's gonna produce more force, but if these smaller motor units that are innervating smaller fibers, if those fibers hypertrophy, then they will produce more force. They could produce equivalent force. And then that's going to change maybe how these motor units are firing differently, because we're only going to turn on a motor unit to match the force needed for that activity. And we'll cover that in a second. Yes?
Would it be possible to hypertrophy half the muscle but not the other half?
Well, it depends on
Kinda
the range. I guess it depends on the range. I think it wouldn't be in a sense like, oh, this half of the muscle, because the muscles are all kind of mixed in heterogeneously. But I think you'd have to think of it as like the total motor units in that muscle. So, for example, if you had 100 motor units in a muscle, but you're only working out in a way that turns on 70% of them, technically, you're only activating 70% of that muscle, right? Because you're not lifting heavy enough to turn on all of those motor units. So theoretically, yeah, you would be training half your muscle, but it's in the sense of the motor units that you're turning on, the muscle fibers you're turning on. All right, so when we think about motor unit recruitment, okay, we are going to recruit motor units and muscle fibers based on the size of those motor units, okay? We're going to recruit smaller motor units first. We do this because the neuron bodies of those small motor units, they don't require a large stimulus to cause depolarization, right? So this is an itty bitty motor neuron body, so a small stimulus is sufficient to cause depolarization. Large motor units have big neuron bodies, they have large axons, so it requires a much greater stimulus to change the resistance to cause depolarization of that neuron body, right? So you're not going to be able to turn on large motor units unless the stimulus is large enough to cause depolarization, right? Large stimuli turn on large motor units. Small stimuli turn on small motor units, right? So if you lift up a 5-pound, dumbbell, you're not going to be turning on your large motor units because 5 pounds is not very heavy, but 5 pounds is heavy enough, light enough to turn on the smaller motor units. So that's why you recruit those first. And when we think about it, right now, if you were to get up and just kind of walk out the door, what types of fibers would you probably be using? Type 1s. Why?
Because you're just walking around.
Walking is not high intensity, not a large stimulus, not a lot of resistance there. But if you went from a walk to a sprint, the forces that your muscles have to resist to get into sprinting, a driving action, is more muscle activation. So the resistance will increase, which means your recruitment will increase of those higher motor units, larger threshold motor units, okay? Those type 2s. That's why you use type 1s with low intensity work, because they're more easily activated with low intensity. It doesn't require a large stimulus, because endurance exercise is not high force. It's actually low force, which is why you can do it for so long. But high intensity exercise requires larger forces, right? So that's why you recruit those type 2s in higher intensity, because you turn those on with higher loads, higher forces, because the stimulus is greater. But what we want to think about here is that the types of motor units, the nomenclature that we're naming them are actually, they can be confusing sometimes, because when we think about a slow twitch motor unit, that's referring to the twitch speed, the rate at which it increases the peak forces with contraction, twitch speed, right? So some motor units, some muscle fibers in those motor units, they twitch very slowly, okay? Those are typically slow twitch motor units and muscle fibers. Typically those are type 1 muscle fibers, right? So in one case, we're talking about the twitching speed, which is related to the neuron innervation, the nerve, the axon, and then you have the fiber type, which is literally just a fiber, right? But those two are connected. So obviously there's a relationship between the neuron and then the fiber, because they're innervating each other, okay? Then you have fast fatigue resistant, meaning that these are fast twitch fibers. They reach peak forces very quickly, but they also don't fatigue very quickly. Those are usually fatigue resistant. We call those type 2As. And then we have fast fatigable, meaning they're fast twitch fibers, but they fatigue very quickly, type 2X. Okay, but here, look how we're talking about the fiber type, but then also over here, we're talking about the neuron characteristics, or the firing of the twitch characteristics. They're related collectively, but they're not exactly the same. Yes? Excitatory action, excitatory stimulatory potential, or something like that. I actually forgot what it means. It's been there for a while. Yeah. Essentially, that yeah. So it causes a change in the exponential much sooner because it's more reactive to that smaller change. But we recruit motor units based on the smaller motor units first, then the larger ones, and then the largest ones, okay? So I like this graph because it kind of summarizes the nomenclature and also the quality of these motor units as well. So if we look here, we could have a slow twitch motor unit. It could also be called slow oxidative. That's talking about the oxidative qualities of the fiber, which is more biochemical, more than like neurological or nervous system. Then you have type 1, which is the myosin heavy chain, or the ATPase, right? But all those collectively, they're used kind of interchangeably, even though they really shouldn't be, but that's kind of the qualities we see about them. What we notice is that the slow twitch, or the type 1s, they have smaller neuron bodies. They usually have a large amount of mitochondrial enzymes, but they have a slow myosin ATPase. Now also, the smaller motor units, the slow twitch motor units, they usually only innervate a few fibers, okay? That's what these three little circles here are. They're innervating a few fibers. If you look at the twitch speeds, slow twitch motor units are called slow twitch because they reach peak forces during a twitch very slowly. So peak forces on the way up are slow, and then relaxation times are also slow. So contraction and relaxation times of these slow twitch motor units are slow. That's why they're called slow twitch. Now, you're familiar with EMG, yes? Right, so you put an EMG sensor on a muscle when you contract. The EMG sensor, you see this light, right, the electrical signal. But what that's really looking at is the firing, the electrical firings of the motor units as a whole in that muscle. So when a slow twitch motor unit or a low, smaller motor unit is activated, it turns on from a weak effort or a weak stimulus. It starts firing, twitching, right? On a high intensity or maximal effort contraction, it fires really fast, okay? Now that differs from a fast fatigue resistant. They're also called fast oxidative glycolytic, right? That's more the chemical quality, or a type 2A motor unit, muscle fiber. Now these type 2As, they have larger neuron bodies. That's why they're turned on later, right? They innervate more muscle fibers, so they're going to produce more force. They have a mix of mitochondrial enzyme content and also fast ATPases, so they're kind of the best of both worlds. They have peak twitch forces are much higher than the slow twitches. And then also, on a weak effort, they actually fire just moderately, just intermittently. But with a maximum effort, they fire quite frequently, right? So now we're seeing during a low intensity or easy contraction, these are turned on first, and these might be turned on a little bit. Max effort contractions, they're both turned on really hard, right? Because it's a higher intensity. Now with the type 2Xs, now here, prior to 1990, I think it's 99 or 2000, we used to think that humans had type 2B fibers, because if you compared rat muscle or mouse muscle to human muscle, in the rats and mice, the type 2Bs would be the fastest fibers in those models. In humans, our fastest fibers, we have 3 types, were the type 2, really they're X's, but because they perform similarly to the 2Bs in animals, we thought we had Bs. Human Genome Project came around, we actually don't have the gene that produces the 2B protein, right? We have 2X. So while mice and rats have, and various other types of animals have, type 2A, 2X, 2B, 2D sometimes, right? We only have 2A and 2X. So if you look at muscle studies from before maybe 2002, 2003, you're going to see 2B. In humans, just in your head automatically, that's not 2B, it's 2X. But they're calling it 2B because they're the fastest fibers in that muscle, right? So these type 2Bs or type 2Xs are called fast fatigable or fast glycolytic. Type 2X, they have the largest neuron bodies, they have very low mitochondrial enzymes, but they innervate a lot of fibers. They're going to produce a lot of force. They have the fastest and highest twitch forces and twitch speeds. They don't turn on at all on weak effort contractions, but they turn on just a little bit at max effort, right? So these muscle fibers or motor units require the highest efforts even to just turn on, whereas these ones don't require the highest efforts to turn on. You can have a low effort kind of contraction, okay? So this is all based around the size principle, okay? So we will recruit motor units based on the amount of force required for that activity. Okay, if I need to lift this mouse, it's not very heavy. I'm not going to turn on my type 2X fibers because it's not heavy enough to turn them on. There's no stimulus high enough to turn them on. Okay, so from here, we're going to start talking about motor units in relationship to the threshold of force needed to turn them on. Okay? So you could have motor units that require a low threshold of force to turn on. So then you will turn on those motor units and produce a low amount of force. You could have motor units that have a high threshold of force required to turn on. So once that force threshold has been met, then you turn on those motor units and you produce a large amount of force. Now, notice how the low threshold motor units generally are smaller motor units. They're innervating smaller fibers. They're usually more oxidative, which is why they're red. The larger motor units are usually innervating more fibers. They're usually more glycolytic, which is why they're white. And they are usually innervating bigger fibers. Okay, so smaller motor units innervate smaller fibers and less fibers. Larger motor units innervate more fibers and bigger fibers. So if we just take that fact, why would higher threshold motor units produce more force compared to lower threshold motor units? Give me 2 reasons why a high threshold motor unit would produce more force than a low threshold motor unit.
There's just more fibers and the fibers are bigger.
Yes, like that first slide, just innervating more fibers makes them produce more force. But also, once you get up here, these motor units are probably innervating thousands of fibers, right? So even if these fibers were the same size as the low threshold, because they're innervating more, they're gonna produce more force. And even if this motor unit up here was innervating less fibers, all those fibers are likely gonna be really, really big, which will produce more force than all the other ones down here, right? So this allows us to recruit and produce force along a spectrum of oxidative capacities and force production, okay? We can turn on oxidative fibers that maybe are type 1, but they happen to be bigger fibers than the ones turned on down here. So maybe you have a type 1 fiber that is producing more force because it's turned on at a higher intensity, but it's still oxidative and producing more force because it's bigger, which would be different than a motor unit or a fiber turned on here. Much, much smaller fibers produces much less force, but can contract all day long, right? So if we think about it, which substrates do the fiber types primarily prefer? We're talking about type 1s and type 2s.
Choose probably glycogen.
Type 2s prefer more carbohydrates, glycogen, okay? Type 1s prefer more fats, right? Because they have capacities or qualities that allow them to use oxygen better. Because they use oxygen better and more efficiently, they can use fats more efficiently, more effectively. So the type 2s, if they have a very limited source of substrate, like glycogen, it wouldn't make sense to be able to turn on your type 2s anytime. Like, I wouldn't want to go and lift this mouse, even just standing here. I wouldn't want to just be moving this mouse around and then be turning on type 2s by accident and depleting all my glycogen. Because once I run out of glycogen, how do I get it back? You have to eat, right? So you would run out of glycogen if you're activating those type 2Xs or 2As too frequently when it's not needed. So it would make better sense to turn on muscle fibers that have almost an unlimited source of energy, like fats, if you're gonna do that activity quite frequently, right? So this is why it kind of allows us to selectively use the motor units and the muscle fibers that are better for certain types of activities, right? You don't want to use glycogen right away on a 5-mile run. You would prefer to use fats, right? Also, running is not very high intensity, so why would we want to use this very limited resource anyway? We prefer to use fats, okay? But if you need to go sprinting, to actually sprint and do more work, well, now we need that energy more quickly. So now we will recruit those type 2s, produce more force, run faster, and to run faster, we're using our glycogen to do the more work faster, right? So we're only gonna recruit the motor units and the muscle fibers necessary to match the external demands of that activity, okay? So why is this important? Because on the exam, I ask questions about what types of intensities are likely to turn on these types of motor units. What types of intensities, what types of activities, or sports activities, or this or that are going to act certain types of fibers, which relates to certain types of substrate use. Okay, if I said you're going to do a 100-meter sprint, what fiber types are primarily activated? 2Xs, glycogen, right? High threshold motor units. Why? Because it's high threshold of forces. So understanding that connection between the intensity and the load and the forces required to do that activity and how the motor units are recruited are essential. Okay, because essentially maybe 30-35% of your exam is the fiber types and the motor units and how they change with training. So this is important. So I like to use this pool analogy with how we activate motor units. So if you have these different types of motor units in a pool, you have people in a pool, okay? Say the water level rises. This water level is high enough to get over the head of this type 1 motor unit. If you were a person in a pool, how would you stay alive? You'd have to swim, right? So if you're laying in a pool and then suddenly the water's over your head, you gotta wake up and you have to start swimming, right? So for this motor unit, now the stimulus is high enough to turn it on, it wakes up and it starts twitching, it starts firing. But this intensity, this stimulus is not high enough to turn on the other motor units. It's only high enough to turn on the lower motor units. What if we increase the water level again? What if the stimulus is even greater? What would happen here? The type 2A would have to now it would start to turn on. What about the 1? What would that have to do? It's already on, but what would it have to do?
Does it activate even more?
Well, it was already turned on here, but now we've increased the intensity, right? How is it going to stay alive now? It's already on. It has to work even harder, right? So the motor units that are already on, when you increase the load or the forces, the motor units that are already on actually start working even harder. They start firing and twitching even faster, right? The ones that just started to turn on, well, now they're just kind of awake and they're just kind of doing their thing, right? But they're just on enough for what you need them to be. They're not working super hard. What if we increase the intensity of stimulus again? Now what would happen? The 2x would turn on, the 1s are firing even faster, and now the 2As that were just kind of on before, now they're working even harder, okay? So imagine this level of water in the pool as like the forces, the threshold of forces required to turn on certain types of muscle fibers. When I did my PhD, my advisor was Dr. Fry. He did a ton of work on muscle fiber types. And when he did his dissertation, and also in his lab when he was at Memphis, they used to call type 2X fibers couch potato fibers. And I was like, well, why do you call them couch potato fibers? He said, because when they go in and do biopsies on sedentary people, compared to athletes or people who train, sedentary people have a very large portion of type 2Xs in their muscles. And you think, well, type 2Xs are important for power activities. Like, type 2Xs produce more force, they contract very quickly. Like, wouldn't you think athletes would have more of those 2Xs? The difference is that untrained people, 50% of their muscle, generally, 50% of their muscle is type 1, 25% is 2A, and around 25% is 2X. But trained people, you see around, depending on the sport, still around 50% type 1, but instead of 25% 2A, it ends up being like close to 40% 2A and 10% 2X. Why? Because those 2Xs, because you activate them at high intensities, because you're turning them on and it releases calcium, they're getting activated, they then convert into a 2A. So now you have a 2X that is still a large fiber, but maybe doesn't contract as fast because it's a 2A now, but it could produce the same amount of force longer. So now you have an X fiber that is now an A fiber that's able to produce more force for a longer period of time. It's less fatigable, okay? That would improve work output performance over a longer period of time. So you see that in trained people, most of the time, especially with lifters, power lifters, they've done studies where they've seen like 1-2% of their muscle fiber type 2X. Because they've been doing it for almost 20 years, almost all those X's have converted into 2As because they work out at such high loads, such high intensities, that if they're training them frequently, they actually shift to become 2A because they're turning them on. We just talked about those mechanisms that cause fibers to shift and become more oxidated, right, with calcium and all that. So, and also, because they call them couch potatoes, right, because they're sedentary. Sedentary people are not activating their muscles, they're not working against loads heavy enough to ever even turn on these 2As, or even the 2Xs. They're probably mostly just turning on the 1s because their daily activities are very light and low intensity, right? So if you start training those 2Xs, yes, they convert to a 2A. But, if 40-year-old virgin, if you don't use it, you lose it. Those X's that convert to A's, if you stop training at that intensity, if those muscles decondition, those A's will go back to an X. Okay? You train again, those X's will go back to the A. So you see shifts between the 2A's and 2X's because they're trainable. But you have a high force fiber, high velocity fiber that's really good at producing force very quickly. But if you're doing lots of exercise, then it might be better to shift to a fiber type that's actually good at doing more exercise, which would be the 2A. And to be honest, back to the 2X's and untrained people, you might think, oh, the 2X's, untrained people have more 2X's to be better at strength and power because they have more of that fiber type, but they're not trained at using those fibers. fibers. It's like an untrained person going to the gym trying to do bench presses. They're not coordinated, they have no synchronization, they can't even recruit those fibers effectively because they never use them. So you don't, when you look at relationships between performance and type 2X fiber type percent in untrained people, there's zero relationship between performance and fiber type percent. But if you look at athletes who are trained, then you see relationships between jumping and speed and sprint ability and type 2X performance, because those athletes are used to training those fibers. And so then in those cases, the amount of 2X's you have actually does relate to and predict performance. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about fiber type shifting in next class. So there's a lot of kind of mechanisms there, so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So to reiterate, this is kind of how you can stain muscle fibers based on the myosin. Usually you see the gray and the black and the white slides. That's ATPases based on the enzyme in myosin. This is using an antibody looking at the myosin heavy chain. Right? So you can have, let's see, the blue ones are type 1 fibers, the green are type 2A, and the black are type 2X. Look at the diversity in the size of the fiber and the fiber types. You have a really big type 1 fiber. You have a really small type 1 fiber. You have a super small 2A, you have a much bigger 2A. You have a smaller 2X, you have a really big 2X right down here, right? So you have a variety of fiber sizes within each fiber type, and that allows you to selectively produce force more accurately depending on the intensity in which fibers need to be recruited. Does that make sense? All right, so it actually works in our favor. So, one last thing about the fiber type stuff. The neuron, we talked about the fiber type, the 2X is converting into the 2A, okay? They did a study like maybe 30, well, longer than that, maybe 40, 50 years ago now. They did it in cats, okay? And they had the neuron, they had a fast twitch neuron innervating a fast twitch muscle in a cat. And they had a slow twitch neuron innervating a slow twitch muscle in the cats. And what they did is they actually switched the neurons, right? So now this slow twitch neuron is innervating a fast twitch fiber, and the fast twitch neuron is innervating the slow twitch muscle group. What do you think happened?
The switch.
The fiber type switched, right? So the neurons, the nervous system activity is what's dictating the fiber type, because if the neuron is firing in a certain pattern, it causes the fiber to shift and have qualities of that firing pattern, right? So if the fiber is used to twitching really fast all the time and contracting all the time, well, now this fast muscle will actually now shift to become more slow twitch because it's being activated all the time. It's recruited, the patterns and the calcium release and all that is more oxidative, so the fiber will shift, okay? And that other fiber type will become the slow twitch. If it fires in a way that's more like a type 2 or a high threshold, it will then shift become a type 2, right? So this just goes to show that the fiber types are really neurologically determined. They're based on the neuron, okay? The neuron behavior. This is why we can't just wake up and think, oh, I'm going to change to 80% type 2 fibers. No, like the type 2 A's and X's can shift because they're innervated by high threshold motor neurons. But you're not going to see a shift between a 2 and a 1 because the neuron qualities are very different between a type 1 motor neuron and a type 2 motor neuron, right? You don't see that shift happening. So like they say, great endurance athletes are really born. Why? Because they're born with 70% type 1s. Who determines that fiber type? Genetics. And part of that genetics is that they have the neural pathways that innervate fibers in a way that make them more type 1. So the nervous system fires in a way that's more type 1, so the fibers are more type 1. Okay? So that's part of that equation there. Now, when I was at Kansas, they did the neuromuscular. I was more, muscle physiology and biochem, but they had several labs there that did more like neuromuscular type of studies. And so they used some equipment there that was called EMG decomposition. So if you're familiar with EMG signals, right, you have You put an EMG sensor over the muscle, okay, it measures the muscle activity. You'll see a electrical signal that kind of looks like that. So as you go to produce more force, you're pushing against something, the force production goes up. The force goes up because you're activating more muscles, okay? And so what we end up seeing is that with higher loads or higher intensities, higher forces, you have greater muscle activation, right? But we don't know which motor units are being activated. We just know that the muscle is more active. But they've developed these algorithms called EMG decomposition, where they actually decompose this electrical signal into the individual motor units firing, okay? Now, this doesn't tell us what fiber type that is, because when we look at the motor unit firing, we're not looking at the myosin heavy chain or the ATPase. We actually don't know what the actual fiber type is, but we do know how the motor unit is behaving. And so that's why from here, we're gonna start talking about motor units, not as this is a type 1 or a type 2A or 2X. We're gonna talk about them as this is a high threshold motor unit. So this is a low threshold motor unit, because this is low because it turned on at a low threshold of force. This is a high threshold motor unit. It turned on a high threshold of force. Does that make sense? But we end up seeing that the patterns of whether this motor unit is low or high threshold, the patterns are actually consistent in their behavior, right? And it kind of shows that there's this regulated kind of strategies for producing force depending on the activity. So these charts essentially show, they did a muscle contraction. So when you look at this x-axis, it shows the time during the contraction. And essentially, are you familiar with a Biodex or a Kincom? If you sit in this chair, it's like an isometric or isokinetic kind of chair. You can apply forces to this, it's kind of like a D extension, but it does or doesn't move, kinetic or isometric. Anyway, what they do is they have you trace a line. It's like a screen shows up and it's a trapezoid. You have to, it's isometric, but you have to push against it and try to match the force. You got to push harder, push harder, push harder. Then you have to hold it, hold it, hold it. And then you have to let go, let go, let go, right? So you are selectively applying force. You're holding that force, and then you're releasing that force. All right, and this is all based on a percentage of your maximum MVC, your maximum voluntary contraction. So when you come in, you contract as hard as you can, they get that value. You contract as hard as you can again, they get that value. Whatever is the highest one, then they choose the forces as relative to your max for the rest of the exercise and the sessions. So we see that in this contraction, it went up. This contraction went up to 50% of your MVC, right? So this would say this contraction was 50% of your maximum force, your maximum strength for an isometric contraction. And what do we see? At the start of contraction, so each of these different colors are a different motor unit. They're even numbered here, motor unit 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, blah, 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 right? So we see that the first motor unit to turn on turns on at the very start or generation of force. And then as we start to produce more force, we start to recruit and turn on more motor units, right? Now notice the spacing. See how they're very kind of sparse and very spread out at the start when they turn on? But as you start to produce more force, notice how they get more dense towards the middle. Because these motor units start firing and twitching faster. If you need to produce more force, you need to recruit more motor units, or those motor units that are on need to fire faster, just like that pool analogy, okay? So what we see is that this was the first to turn on. We recruited up to 21 motor units. This was the last one to turn on at 50% via MVC. It stayed on as long as you were at 50% intensity. And as soon as you needed to produce less than 50% max, it turned off, right? And then when you need to produce less than 30, 48, 45, 40, these other ones started to turn off. And they all turned off in an orderly fashion until we get to the last one. The first motor unit to turn on is the last one to turn off. The last motor unit to turn on is the first one to turn on. because we're only turning on motor units to match the forces needed during that activity. If we don't need that force anymore, it turns off. If we need more force, we turn on more. And the one that's on, fire faster. Does that make sense? Now these are the individual firings. You can average these pulses into pulses per second, and we end up getting a graph that looks like this. So we can see that this blue line is that first blue motor unit. This red one is that third motor unit up there, right? As you can see, when you average them, that when this motor unit turned on at 6% of force, maximum force, when it first turned on, it was pulsing at 5 pulses per second. But when we got up to 50% MVC, it was pulsing at 26 pulses per second. Right? So when we needed to produce more force, it actually fired faster. And at the same time, notice how these other motor units turned on as well. Now, the motor units that turned on later, are they firing as fast as the earlier ones? No, right? The motor units will only turn on as fast as they need to maintain the peak force. If the force goes up, they will fire faster. If they don't need to produce more force, they will just fire as they are, okay? Now notice, this last motor unit that turned on, it's firing at what? First turned on was 1 pulse per second. That's like so slow, right? During the plateau, its peak pulse per second, peak firing rate was around 6 or 7 pulses per second, right? So at some point it was pulsing faster during that plateau, but it was all to maintain that target force, okay? As soon as we didn't need that force anymore, it shut off. Now, we're gonna call this a low threshold motor unit because it turned on at a low threshold of force, 6% MVC. Notice, this motor unit didn't turn on until 7 seconds into the contraction. So how do we know whether that's a high threshold or a low threshold? Well, we just look at the time that it turned on and then go up to the force. Oh, you turned on here, the force at that time was 50% MVC, right? This motor unit, this blue one here, this turned on here, okay, which was 25% MVC, okay? So we can say this is a low threshold motor unit, that's a high threshold motor unit because we know the threshold of force that turned it on, right? We don't know what fiber type these are. We can't say this one here is a type 2X, it's high threshold, it's 2X. We don't know, this is actually only 50% of your max. So we don't know if it's actually a type 1, it could be a 2A, probably not a 2X, could be depending on the muscle. I don't think it is, it's only 50%. So it's not telling us fiber type, but we do end up seeing patterns of behavior and how they fire and turn on depending on the load and the fiber type qualities. See, this type 1, or not type 1, this low threshold motor unit, it fires fast, but it maintains its firing throughout the entire contraction, right? What types of muscles can maintain long periods of contraction?
Type 1s.
Type 1s, right? Which muscles cannot maintain long periods of contraction?
2Xs.
Type 2Xs, right? So not saying that this is a type 2X, but if you did a contraction that was like 90-95% of your max, you can be pretty sure the last motor units recruited are most likely going to be 2X. You don't know for sure, but you would suggest based on the motor unit pool that's more likely, right? But these motor units, these low threshold motor units, they're firing in a way, these sustained contractions that are kind of similar to what you might see with type 1 muscle fiber, right? But it's the behaviors of those motor units that are similar around these qualities of muscle fiber types. Now, one question. This motor unit in the yellow, is this a high threshold motor unit or a low threshold motor unit? There's one right here in the yellow. Is it high threshold or low threshold?
Kind of like in the middle. Middle.
Did it turn on at a higher threshold of force than the other ones? Yeah, it turned on at, maybe 30%. But is it a lower threshold than other ones? Yes, because there's other motor units that turned on at higher thresholds before. So when we look here, we can't say this is a high threshold motor unit. We're not saying that it is. We usually term them as higher or lower because this is all relative. This motor unit is a higher threshold motor unit compared to all these ones because it turned on at higher forces. But it's a lower threshold motor unit compared to these other ones which turned on at higher forces, right? So in the same sense, this motor unit is a earlier recruited motor unit compared to these ones, but it's a later recruited motor unit compared to these ones which turned on earlier. So it's all relative. So why am I going on about this? Because on the exam, I ask you questions using terminology like an earlier recruited motor unit compared to a later recruited motor unit, a higher threshold motor unit versus a lower threshold motor unit, a faster firing motor unit versus a slower firing motor unit. You have to understand those terminologies to know kind of where they fit into this, motor unit behavior schemes. Okay, so just kind of start practicing that with the higher versus lower versus earlier versus later because those terms come on the exam and you want to be prepared for seeing them on the exam. Now, this motor unit behavior scheme is actually called the onion skin theory because if you look at the firing patterns and the recruitment ranges and the behaviors of these motor units, they actually look like the peels of an onion, okay? Where you have the first motor units that turn on, or they have the fastest firing rates as you start to produce more force. They're also the last ones to turn off. The later ones that turn on have slower firing rates, and they are the first ones to turn off as the forces go down. So it's called the onion skin theory based on the patterns of the motor unit behavior, and they look like the peels of an onion. That's why we call it that. So on the exam, they'll say, hey, based on the onion skin theory, this, right? So make sure you don't forget that in terms of how this idea of these motor units are behaving. Okay? Questions so far? So when we look at intensity, so that one was just a contraction that went up to 50% of your MVC. But what about the behavior of these motor units at different types of intensities? So we had a contraction that went up to 20% MVC. Every single dot is a motor unit and its firing rate at that intensity. So this motor unit turned on at like 1% MVC. And its highest firing rate was 25 pulses per second in this 20% contraction. They're all blue. In the 20% contraction, this motor unit turned on at 20% MVC, and its highest firing rate was around 14 pulses per second. These are the firing rates during a 20% contraction. When they have the same subjects then do a 50% contraction, notice how at every intensity, the motor unit that turned on at that load, once it got up to 50% MVC, was actually firing faster. So this motor unit that turned on at 5% MVC, it was actually firing at almost 29 pulses per second, right? Whereas before the 20% contraction, it was likely only pulsing at 20 pulses per second, right? So higher intensities means that these motor units, when they get turned on, they actually fire faster. And also, look how many more motor units we've recruited. In the 20% contraction, we've turned on 15 motor units. In the 50% contraction, we've turned on 24. We turned on almost twice the amount of motor units to produce twice the amount of force. Does that make sense? And a key thing here, these motor units that turned on at higher intensities, notice how their firing rates are lower than the motor units that turned on at lower intensities, okay? What if you do a contraction up to 100% MVC? Well, all the motor units that turned on at 50% MVC here, look how high their firing rates are now. They fire even faster. It's a maximal contraction, right? And all these ones up here, they fire even faster too. And we turn on even a few more fire rates. Yes?
How come the motor unit count goes down as you increase?
I'm going to get to that. So, one of the downsides of this type of technology that uses, they have the EMG signal and it decomposes the signals into the individual firings based on algorithms. The problem is that those firings are looking at the action potential signals of the motor units actually firing. And different motor units have different action potential amplitude sizes. So smaller motor units have smaller amplitude firings. Larger motor units have larger amplitude firings. Which muscle fiber types tend to be larger? Type 2s. So in lower contractions, lower intensity contractions, we actually see, we pick up these motor units because the amplitudes are reasonable, they're not picked up as noise. But with high intensity contractions, because the high threshold motor units are turned on, they have such big amplitudes, these algorithms sees the smaller motor units, their activity as noise. It filters the noise out. It's kind of like you go to a beach, you know, you can see the waves coming up against the shore. When it's small waves, you can see every single wave. If there's a tsunami coming, literally the size of that giant wave kind of makes everything else look small in comparison. So you don't even notice the smaller waves anymore because you have this really big one being activated. That's what happens with the algorithms, that because the amplitudes of the type 2s are so much bigger, because they're bigger muscles, bigger fibers, bigger neurons, everything's just larger in the amplitude. When it goes to the algorithms, it actually even though it's actually picking up the smaller motor units, it registers them as like noise, right? So it kind of discounts them, even though it is actually true. So this has its downside in the sense that, yes, you can describe behavior with a larger range of intensities, but it does also have limitations as well, because before, if you wanted to study motor unit behavior, like actual motor unit firing in the muscle, you had to take a really fine wire, about the thickness of a hair or so, you had to insert it into the muscle, and you had to do contractions with a needle in your muscle, a wire in your muscle. The problem with that is that you were actually measuring the firings of that motor unit, but because it's only a singular wire, you're only picking up a few motor units, very small number. And you can't contract at high intensities with a needle here. It's actually painful. That was one of the limiting factors. They couldn't do high intensities because the harder they contracted, the more painful it got, and they couldn't do high forces with the needle in there, right? So we discovered a lot of information about low threshold or motor unit behavior at low intensities because we could use indwelling needles and wires to measure those behaviors at low intensities. We had very limited knowledge at what happened at higher intensities because we couldn't do it. These algorithms actually allow us to look at the higher intensities in a much broader range, which is good, but when we start doing higher intensities, then if they're too high, then we actually miss some of the information from the lowest part of that spectrum, right? So the technology is still improving, it's still getting better as we go. Now, also this is mostly isometric contractions. They've just started developing and doing dynamic contractions as well, so it's improving, but it just takes time to get there, okay? So, what do we see here? That in general, as the intensity increased, the motor units that were on fired faster and we recruited more of them. Now, one thing to note about fatigue, okay? In this is the last thing we'll cover and then we'll be done. But in this part, they have individuals do a contraction up to 30% of their MVC. But they had to hold that contraction for an entire minute. And so it was only one set, but every rep was 1 minute in length. So they ramped up, then they held that contraction for like 55 seconds, and then they ramped down. And then they did another rep. Held it for a minute, and then ramped down. So they did another contraction every minute. There's an isometric contraction essentially for a minute, every minute. And what do we see? If they did 10 reps, so 12 minutes total, right? This would be a contraction maybe at 1 or 2 reps in. This would be contraction maybe 5 or 6. And this would be contraction at the very, very end, the last contraction that they did. So fatigue, failure. What do we see? At the start of contraction, at the start of this set, when there's no fatigue, we see, okay, we're turning on these motor units, they're firing, they increase their firing rates to match the plateau, match the forces there, and then they go down. In the middle of that set, after we've accumulated some fatigue, notice we start recruiting some more motor units, and the motor units that are turned on actually start firing faster. Now, the force is the same, 30% MVC, but the motor unit behavior starts changing under fatigue to match those forces. And then at maximum fatigue, like literally the last rep, notice we recruited even more motor units, and the motor units are firing, in general, firing faster to meet those forces, okay? So when you fatigue, you actually start to recruit more motor units to try to maintain those forces. The problem is, the motor units that are recruited later, they're not good at maintaining forces, so they're more easily to fatigue as well. So they fatigue even more. So obviously, if you look here, the EMG signals, you can see the EMG gets bigger as we go from no fatigue, middle fatigue, heavy fatigue, right? We can see the muscle activation gets more when we reach fatigue. So yes, we can say the muscle was more active. When we look at the motor unit behavior, we can say, oh, it was more active because we were recruiting more motor units and they were firing faster. In some papers where they do EMG, they will say, oh, there were more motor units firing faster. This EMG signal doesn't tell you that. It just tells you how active was the muscle as a whole, not telling you which individual motor units were turned on or how they were firing. So yeah, this is telling about global muscle activation, but not necessarily the muscle motor unit behavior. This is, okay? But we do see that as we start to fatigue, we start to behave a little bit different with the recruitment strategies. And one thing that's important here, we talk about action potential amplitude. The motor units that were turned on early in that set when there was no fatigue, notice how those motor units had very small action potential amplitudes. Okay, the action potential amplitude kind of looks like this, right? Small amplitude, large amplitude. So the motor units that were turned on early in contraction, they had small amplitudes. The motor units that turned on later in contraction at fatigue, they had larger amplitudes. Remember I said larger motor units have larger amplitudes? Those larger motor units have larger amplitude because larger motor units innervate more fibers and those fibers are bigger, which means that's why the amplitudes are larger. So that tells us that when we get to fatigue, we are trying to maintain the force by recruiting more motor units that produce more force so we can maintain it. Does that make sense? So we will go over this concept again next week with resistance training and motor unit behavior. What we end up seeing is that there's changes in how the motor units fire and how they're recruited based on your training status and the intensities used as well. So we'll cover a little bit of that next week with the fiber type stuff. At the end of next week, I believe you have a quiz that will be on motor unit behavior. I think 3 out of the 4 questions are just from this lecture. There's one question from the resistance training motor unit